Hello, everyone. My topic today is connecting our faith life and work life. Faith and work has been a topic that's been around forever, but in my experience, most Christians don't really understand or interpret that in a way that is useful for them. And my hopes today is that I'm going to provide you a few nuggets that will cause you to investigate the topic further and hopefully get you to be more purposeful in connecting your faith and your work. Now, I'm not a pastor, and most people who know me, especially my wife, actually think that's probably good. But I have spent some 40 years in the marketplace and have plenty of bruises and lumps and scar tissue as evidence of that. But as my story goes, I gave my life to Christ when I was a young man. But as I entered the workforce, and for the first many years, I really struggled with that. See, my career advancement went a lot faster than the maturity of my faith. And the result of that was, of course, my fair share of disappointment, frustration, and failures. Fortunately, along the line, I began to understand and appreciate what my calling in the workplace actually was, and was able to begin to purposely connect my faith with work. The good news in all of that, of course, is that I learned a lot. I certainly grew a lot. I saw a lot, made a lot of observations, and for sure gained a perspective of my faith as it related to my work. But before I go further, I want to tell you that Tim Keller, who many people know, the senior pastor at Redeemer Church, wrote a book called Every Good Endeavor a number of years ago that really helped me to shape and understand this topic. And I'm going to take you through a few of those topics today to help you gain a better appreciation of applying your faith to your work. So that being said, let me get started by giving you 6 key learnings or observations that I'd like you to consider. The first one is that from my observation, experience, and readings, that most or many Christians keep their faith life and their work life separate or compartmentalized. Church is my time with God, and at work, I'm just trying to make a living and just trying to get on. And why is that? Well, some interpret faith and work as the obligation to evangelize in the break room, and most people just won't do that or will avoid that. And the other is believing that God actually doesn't really care about their work, that it's part of the curse, and it's just something to endure and to get past. Number 2, we spend 80% or more of our waking hours at work, which leaves 20%, obviously, where we're not. Number 3, without faith at work or applying your faith in your workplace, work will tend to shape you and even destroy you. There is no more fertile ground for the temptation of sin than in the workplace. And some examples of that, as I'm sure all of you know, are the chasing of money and power, ethical issues, infidelity, broken homes as a result of behavior of working longer hours and spending less time in relationships with your family, or bringing the baggage home and laying it at the feet of your loved ones. And another one, which is very significant, is when work becomes your identity. Work becomes your identity, one of 2 things can happen. One, if you're successful, it goes to your head, which is never a good thing. Or if you fail, it goes to your heart and can be crushing. But let's talk about number 4. Many Christians on Monday don't look, talk, or act like they did on Sunday. They tend to blend in with the crowd. Number 5, this is the topic of people who, and especially in the current environment, who are constantly looking for another opportunity or job hopping. Here's what we know. People don't quit companies. People quit people. The end result is usually never satisfying. And point number 6 is that chasing a bigger paycheck and rationalizing that, hey, if I make more money, I can tithe more, or hey, as long as I've got to do this lousy job, at least I'm going to get paid for it, also never ends up satisfying. So let's move into where do we go from here? And the topic of calling. And we've all heard about calling. Many of us have gone through exercises trying to figure out what calling means. But for me personally, and for many of my friends, there was at least one period in our lives where we get wrapped around the axle of trying to understand what exactly is our calling. So there's two perspectives on calling that I think will resonate. The first perspective is referred to as fixed calling, which is you are called by God to do something very specific, some very specific job, such as you're called to the ministry or you're called to the mission field. Very few of us receive that kind of calling. Most of us, I would contend, fall into the category of a formative calling. And that's a calling that you discover through time. It's a calling that can, in fact, evolve throughout your life and through different phases of your life. And it requires, and this is probably the most important point, it requires you to understand the kind of person that you are becoming. Understand the kind of person you're becoming, which would suggest that there's change in you. So in total, our vocation or our calling is not truly found until we are fit. Let's compare that to someone who says, hey, I want to be a professional musician. What's required to become a professional musician? Well, it's more than chopsticks in the key of C for sure. It's years and years of practice and lessons and performance and critique and failure. And quite honestly, not everybody makes it. In fact, along that path or that continuum, some people discover that they might be better at being recording engineers or conductors or what have you, and not necessarily a concert pianist. So let's move on. And again, not forgetting this idea of that, this formative calling idea suggests that we continue to evolve in our faith. So let's talk about relationships, because relationships matter to God. Cultivating, forming, and maintaining relationships in the workplace is absolutely vital. And why is that? Because relationships equals influence. And without a relationship, there is no influence. Let's put that into context. We hear often from our pastors that we are to engage with people in our sphere of influence. Of course, if you ask the question, what's a sphere, which probably means there are people around us, and that expects that there is some amount of influence within that sphere, but what if there's not? So relationships equals influence. But relationships are really hard. They're not so hard to begin. They're certainly challenging to deepen, and they are really tough to maintain. And why is that? It's that way because it takes a lot of energy. And why else, by the way, are relationships so difficult? Because it takes two to have a relationship, and the other person gets to make a decision. And they can decide whether or not they want to be in a relationship with you. So, where does that take us? Well, going back to the instrument analogy, because the point that we're at now is, I'm not really sure where I'm at, or in terms of people's perception of where I'm at in my faith, in my workplace, and the influence that I have or don't have, and how do I increase that influence in other people's lives? So if you decide today, after being away from your instrument for the last 20 years or 10 years or what have you, and you decide to take a lesson, what happens at the first lesson? Well, there's an assessment by the instructor. They have you play songs or scales or what have you, and they're trying to determine a starting point. And you to understand what your starting point is so that they can lay out a specific plan for your development so that you can achieve the level of performance that you're after. So it's the same thing, I believe, in our spiritual walk, in terms of our maturity. So I'm going to suggest to you this exercise that I would encourage you to use in your small group, in your men's group, women's group, or even a group at work. I've used this with a number of my leadership teams through the years, and it was quite eye-opening and quite successful. And in those cases, it was part of leadership development, which influence and leadership are pretty much one and the same. So here's what I'd like you to do. Get a group of people together. Make sure everyone has a piece of paper and a pen. And I need you to set the stage. Ask that group of people to think of someone in their life, or formerly in their life, that they were just naturally attracted to, just really enjoyed being around, loved being around, felt fulfilled being around that individual. It could be a grandparent that's no longer with us, but it has to be someone that they actually knew. And once they have the picture of that individual in their mind's eye, have them write down 3 to 5 of the attributes that describes that person. Give them a few minutes to do that. You do the same. Then as the scribe, go around the room or go to each person and one at a time have them identify one of those attributes and collect those attributes on a sheet of paper. Some of them are going to duplicate. But you collect it, and at the end, you've got a description. Show that description or show that list of attributes to each of the participants and ask, is there anything on this list that does not fit the person that you were thinking about? The chances are the answer is going to be no. So now here's what you know. There are at least 6 people, real people, that actually look like this. Now, examining those traits, which will look like things like kindness, and they care about me, maybe they're smart, they put me first, etc. If you look at that list and ask the group, wouldn't it be great if your boss looked like that? Wouldn't it be great if your coworker looked like that? Wouldn't it be great if your spouse looked like that? Wouldn't it be amazing if you looked like that? Because the other analysis you can make of this list is, it looks an awful lot like Jesus. But it's real people. So the good news is, it's achievable. The question is, where are you? So if the same group assessed you with those attributes, would they be identical? Chances are they might not. So there's a gap between this description and you. What does that mean? Well, if the gap is significant, if we're talking about building relationships with this person, or having influence in this person's life, even though you work right next to them, the probabilities are pretty low. But the more you reflect this, the higher the probability and the more influence you're going to have, the easier the relationship becomes in terms of the deepening and the sustaining of that relationship. And of course, if you get into this proximity, you have significant influence in their life, which in the workplace is critical. You know, I've heard it said so many times that I can't do anything about the issues. I can't do anything about the culture because I don't have the title. I can assure you that in order to change a culture inside any organization, it takes more than a title, and it takes more than one person. And so there's where the journey begins. So you can't do this assessment by yourself, even though it's called self-assessment, because we tend to overscore our performance. You need someone or someone's in your life that can give you the feedback. Probably not your spouse. Really good if it could be somebody at work. Those that get to actually watch you in action in terms of how you behave. So what does that mean? First lesson, The instructor just told us what our starting point is. What do you do about it? Well, the next part of this journey is what I'll refer to as getting ready to get into the gym. Because you can't go past this next topic and begin to believe that you can shape yourself in Christ's image if you don't start with your heart. And if you want to experience God's presence in the workplace, you have to commit your heart to Him. And what does that actually mean? It means you have to commit to a lifestyle of repentance and faith. Example, if you are in a state, let's say, of God consciousness as you are driving down the highway, and that white Volvo aggressively cuts in front of you, even purposely, the reaction that you will have in that moment will probably be a lot different than the reaction that you would have if you were not in that state. Or let's go to the workplace. If that person that tends to make the hair on the back of your neck stand to attention gets, let's say, in your face, and you are in that state of God consciousness, chances are, in that moment, you will have a very different reaction than you would if you weren't. So your heart matters to God. Your heart and the transformation of your heart is required for you to change how you look, how you act, and how you present yourself as the light of Christ. So let's talk about disciplines for a moment, because disciplines matter. Richard Foster, let me just read this for you. Richard Foster, from his book, The Celebration of Disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are habits, practices, and experiences that are designed to develop, grow, and strengthen certain qualities of spirit, to build the muscles of one's character and expand the breadth of one's inner life. They structure the workouts which train the soul. What we hear often from our pastors is that to work out our faith takes a lot more than just showing up on Sunday and listening to the pastor's message. They often talk about the need for us to engage daily, certainly in time in prayer and in the Bible. And most of us hear that and say, yeah, that's logical, but we tend not to do it. And the tending not to do it is like the person that says, I'm going to get into the gym, and maybe they start by going to the gym once a week. And for those of you who are devoted exercise folks, you know that working out once a week doesn't really move the needle, that it takes a much more consistent process. So back to those spiritual disciplines, and just there's a lot of them out there, but let's just talk about 7 of them for a moment, or list 7 of them. So we're talking about prayer, worship, study, fellowship, fasting, self-examination, again, not alone, and gratitude. Let's put that into the context of going to the gym. Let's just say prayer is like bench pressing, and worship is leg presses, and study is arm curls. They are behaviors that you have to have a consistent, disciplined approach to. And the more effort you put into that, let's go back to the idea of what is my calling, which again says that you have to understand how you're progressing through time and how hard you're working at that progression, which is the transformation of being more Christ-like, which we already talked about, is a list that looks like this, to develop your spiritual maturity so that you have more influence in your workplace, and that the ultimate objective is that you are joining with others to actually change what's happening in that environment or in that culture. I'm going to stop there for today. There are a number of other topics and areas of learning and understanding, to include ethics, to include excellence in work, and so on. But my prayer is that you will continue to explore this topic for yourself, for others, that you will join with others who are on a similar journey to help each other work out your faith and begin in a very purposeful way to connect your faith with your work. And as I like to say, avoid a Corinthians 3 moment, which, if you may recall, Paul said, and I quote, "Brothers, I gave you milk, not solid food, because you were not ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready for it. You are still worldly." I believe that when we gave our life to Jesus, besides what we typically say we're to be the light of Jesus, and we are to care for our neighbors and love our neighbors as we love ourselves, we are also to engage in the process of renewal, which he started. In our engagement, where 80% of our time or more is spent, could be and should be in the workplace. And the worst thing that I believe can happen is to be called out on that, or get to heaven and meet Paul and have him talk to you about milk. Thanks, everybody.